Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about what makes a good phrase sound so melodic. There are three components in particular that make the structure of a phrase sound really melodic. And so we're going to get into that today by looking at a few phrases from some of my favorite jazz legends. And we're also going to look at some phrases that I've constructed specifically to help you get the hang of melodic structures and fundamentals. And if you want to get a download of these phrases, they're all part of a new PDF package that I just released with jazz lesson videos called 65 Melodic Phrases for Jazz Musicians. That PDF package has phrases written out through the keys, plus backing tracks and recordings of each phrase. And you'll see that the phrases from this ebook and the phrases that we check out today all utilize these three different components. So we'll definitely make sure you really get a hang of these concepts. So let's jump into all of that now, but real quick, a friend of mine told me that in the beginning of videos, I'm supposed to tell all of you to subscribe. So if you haven't already, make sure to smash that subscribe button and click the bell button for notifications so you'll know as soon as I release new content. All right, so let's do it. Now let's jump into these phrases and let's talk about what makes these phrases so melodic. So again, there are three components that are really important for understanding what makes phrases sound melodic in jazz. Those components are voice leading, linear fluency, and harmonic embellishment. So let's start with that first component, which is voice leading, and that's going to be really key. Now just hang with me for a second because this is going to sound a little complicated for a minute, but at the end of all of this, I promise it's going to be a lot more simple and easier to apply than you might think. So first off, what is voice leading? Well, according to Wikipedia, and this is actually a pretty good definition, voice leading is the linear progression of individual melodic lines and their interaction with one another to create harmonies, typically in accordance with the principles of common practice harmony and counterpoint. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in really plain terms, that just means multiple notes moving in ways that sound nice and melodic. But there was a key reference there to the technique called counterpoint. Okay, so what is counterpoint? Okay, well, the Oxford definition of counterpoint is the art or technique of setting, writing, or playing a melody or melodies in conjunction with another, according to fixed rules. All right, so pretty much all you need to know here is that for centuries, music theorists have been trying to define rules that you can follow to make multiple notes sound really melodic when they're all put together. So how does that apply to jazz? Well, in jazz, when we're soloing, we're usually thinking about lines that navigate through chord changes. So we'll play a single note line that works in conjunction with the chords that are being played in the band, or by ourselves if we're a chordal instrument. Now this might all sound really overwhelming right now, but trust me, it's gonna get a lot easier. Okay, so let's break this down. How do we use the laws of counterpoint to create strong voice leading in jazz? And first off, maybe we should ask, why should we want to? I mean, when we first learn about jazz when we're growing up, we're told that there are no wrong notes in jazz. And so that might sound really cool because it makes jazz sound defiant and adventurous. And honestly, it is, but it's an oversimplification. Because honestly, it sells short the fact that jazz musicians were actually masterful at the laws of counterpoint and voice leading. And then they would add to those concepts and also add in chromaticism and rhythmic embellishment on top of that. So they really truly were geniuses. But now that's already been done, we have the luxury of observing the language and learning the language from those masters. And so if all the legends were masters of these techniques, then clearly jazz language actually does have a basis in voice leading and counterpoint. And so now we should ask, how do we apply this ourselves? And what does it look and sound like in jazz? So essentially, instead of classical counterpoint, where we have all these individual notes that are being planned, in jazz we usually just have a single note line that the soloist is playing, and multiple notes are being played by a chordal instrument. Now, the chords being played are improvised, so anything can happen, but usually in jazz, the pianist or guitarist is going to be improvising chords that are built off of a set form. So if we're coming up to a G minor 7 in the form, we know they're going to build a chord with the notes G, B flat, D, and F. And we'll also know that they'll probably be adding notes into the chord coming from a scale, like the Dorian scale, just to add more color to the sound. Now, if we want to improvise melodically through common chord progressions, that's when the laws of counterpoint and voice leading are really going to come in handy. But honestly, the full set of rules and study of this method is really complicated, and we don't really need to know them for just improvising single note lines. So the main ideas that we can get from counterpoint rules are as follows. 1, improvising with stepwise motion sounds great. 2, if you skip degrees in the scale to use wider shapes in the line, then sticking with chord tones will sound really good. And finally, 3, if you're going from one chord to another, then stepping into or around a chord tone that lands on the downbeat of the chord you're going into, that will sound great. So to get a better idea of how this all works, let's check out a phrase that uses all 3 of these counterpoint voice leading laws and get a sense of how it actually works in a real phrase. So let's check out a phrase from this downloadable PDF. This is on a backdoor 2-5 progression. That's just a cool term for a substitute 2-5 that ends up sounding like it comes from below the tonic instead of above. It's also a chord progression that can be used as an actual standard progression. It comes up in all sorts of tunes, everything from There Will Never Be Another You to Yardbird Suite. And essentially the way that it works is it just comes from a dominant chord a whole step below the tonic. And then if you go backwards and find the relative 2 minor of that dominant chord, then you're gonna have a full backdoor 2-5. And what's more important to understand with this is that it's just a great sound. It sounds like this. Now with the phrase written on this chord progression, you're gonna see right off from the top, we've got straight stepwise motion right up the scale from the root of the F minor 7 to the 5th of that F minor 7. Then from there, we skip a step, and remember when we're jumping around, it always works great to go from one chord tone to another. So you'll see we skip from the 5th of the F minor 7 up to the 7th of the F minor 7. Then we've got stepwise motion, perfect voice leading down into the root of the next chord. We land on the root of the B flat 7. Then we skip down to the 6th and we step right up into the 9th of the chord. And then here we do something a little fancy where we play the upper tensions of the chord. So when you see that C, E flat, and G at the end of this B flat 7 measure, really what that is the 9th, 11th, and 13th of the chord. Remember when I mentioned that a lot of times the pianist or guitarist or chordal instrument will add in some other notes from the scale to build the chord? Well, if we embellish that in the line that we play, it's gonna sound really melodic. So that's all we're doing here. We're just adding some of the more colorful notes into the scale. Then when we get up to that G natural on the B flat 7, which is the 13 of the chord, we step right down into the 3rd of the C major 7. So that's gonna be picture perfect voice leading right there. Then from there, again, we're jumping down from one chord tone to another, jumping from that 3rd on the C major 7 down to the 5th, hitting that G. Then it's just all diatonic material right through the end. And as you can see, even in this last bar, when we're staying on the same chord, because the last bar of the phrase is still C major, we're still voice leading within that C major chord. You'll see that stepwise motion bringing us into the 3rd again in that 4th bar. So in this ebook, you'll see there are a bunch of common chord progressions that the phrases are written on, and each chord progression has a section of phrases that are dedicated to this voice leading concept. So even if you don't understand all the details that we just went over, the main thing is to just memorize some phrases using this concept so you can digest good, solid language that has really strong voice leading in it. And doing that is really gonna help you start to play your own melodic phrases more naturally. So now let's check out an example from a legend. I love this 2-5-1 phrase from Dexter Gordon. He plays this on the bridge of the track Love for Sale off of the classic album Go. And next we'll actually talk about how it uses the 2 other melodic concepts that I mentioned earlier. The 2 other components to melodic structures are really clear in this phrase, so let's check that out now. All right, so this is such a great phrase because not only does it use really strong voice leading, again, it uses the two other components that I mentioned earlier. And remember, those components are linear fluency and harmonic embellishment. So linear fluency just simply means being fluent with your lines. And so that means being able to improvise with all the notes that make up the scale base of a chord. So a lot of times when I hear a more developing player, they might be able to stab at a few notes of the scale base of the chord, but then they're not able to construct a line using all the notes of that scale. And so then they sound a lot less fluent with the harmony. So for instance, an example of just stabbing at a few notes in the scale would sound like this. Compared to a line that's going to use all the notes in the scale base of the chord, that's going to sound like this. Now, it can still sound totally cool to use some and not all of the notes in the scale. It's just going to sound more sparse. So if you know what you're doing and you really hear it, it can actually create a really cool effect. And it can really build intensity as you gradually start to add more notes in. And so doing that as an exercise is actually a really great way to practice linear fluency. The perfect reference for this is how Miles Davis solos on the beginning of his solo on So What from the legendary album Kind of Blue. The first two A sections of that solo look and sound like this. And I'm just going to play this myself, because every once in a while, YouTube will actually mute a track if you're playing an actual copyrighted track in a video. So what we see here is Miles gradually adds notes in from the scale bit by bit. So instead of playing the whole scale all at once, he paces himself gradually. And again, this idea is actually a great exercise, and it's something that I like to call modal expansion, which is just gradually adding in notes from the mode. A mode is just a fancy way of saying a scale that comes from a modal system. That's just a fancy way of saying that any tonal system can build other sounds from that tonal system. Honestly, the important thing here is just to know that any scale can be gradually expanded on, and that's a great exercise to practice. And so I highly recommend practicing that on your own through different tonalities. And if you want a resource on that, we have some exercises written out for you. These are all through the keys on major, dominant, and minor tonality in this new Melodic Phrases ebook. So here's an example of one of those modal expansion exercises from this PDF package, just so you can check it out and get a better idea of how this stuff works. So by working through exercises like this through the keys, you're going to get really flexible in all the different scales that you really need to have down in jazz. And that will really start to come out in your playing the more you work on this exercise. So again, this is going to be one of the best ways to develop your linear fluency. It's one of the best ways to sound a lot more fluent in the lines that you play by becoming a lot more fluent in the scales. And of course, if you want to play phrases like that Dexter Gordon phrase where you play all of the notes in the scale in just a single phrase, you can check out all the sections on linear fluency within this PDF package. So again, every common chord progression in this PDF package is going to have a section within that with phrases dedicated to the linear fluency concept. Then you can pick whatever phrases you like best, and you can start internalizing that language so you can really digest these concepts. And so now remember, we've got one more component to melodic structures in jazz. That's going to be this idea of harmonic embellishment. So what does that mean? So as I mentioned earlier, the jazz legends were so amazing with counterpoint and voice leading concepts, but But then they went beyond that and they started adding melodic chromaticism and rhythmic embellishments. So they started embellishing the harmony in a way that was so much more intricate. And so from a harmonic standpoint, these rhythmic and chromatic embellishments that they would add are a huge part of what makes jazz so unique. For a great example of harmonic embellishment, let's check out this phrase from this Charlie Parker solo on Moose the Mooch, which is pretty much a rhythm changes tune. So remember, there are two things that we're looking for in particular here: chromatic and rhythmic embellishment. So right off the top of this phrase, we see some 16th notes that bring us from the third of the chord to the root. And then we step down diatonically to the root of the next chord, which is G7. From there, Bird plays chromatically to get down into the third of C minor 7. So we can see perfect voice leading with chromaticism added to it. So next we just see chord tones on the C minor 7, and then on the F7 he was probably just doing a really bluesy anticipation of the B flat 7. Then from there he does more chromaticism from the 9th to the 7th, voice leading into the E flat 7, a nice diatonic shape, and then on the A flat 7 we see this really cool rhythmic embellishment of the chord tones at the end. Now, if you don't feel like analyzing phrases in this much detail, don't worry, that's totally cool. The important thing is to have a general idea of the concepts being used and to be aware of how the harmony is being outlined. And again, if you play through this stuff a lot and memorize some different phrases that use these concepts, it's really going to start to internalize and come out naturally in your playing. Especially if you're learning content that's on common chord progressions that you're going to be playing through all the time when you're improvising. So in the Melodic Phrases ebook PDF package, we definitely have a bunch of phrases utilizing this harmonic embellishment concept. And so here's an example of that on a really common chord progression, a 3-6-2-5. And so you can see there's a lot of chromaticism and rhythmic embellishment here. And what makes it a melodic phrase is the use of all three of the concepts we talked about today. We're seeing voice leading, we're seeing linear fluency, and we're also seeing the harmonic embellishment all the way through. So a lot of these phrases obviously get pretty advanced, but don't shy away to jumping into this stuff. When I first started playing saxophone, I would get really bored when I had to play through the basic stuff like Mary Had a Little Lamb. But I knew through my dad that Charlie Parker was one of the greatest saxophonists that ever lived, and so I was really excited about the idea of actually learning something that Charlie Parker played. And so when I was only 10 years old, I actually started learning Charlie Parker phrases, and I would have to take it incredibly slow, like one measure a day practically. But I would be really engaged in it because it was such advanced material that I knew it was the best of the best that I was playing. So even though I would move through this stuff really slow, it very quickly started making me develop at a really fast rate. So because of that, I'm always a huge advocate of practicing stuff that might be a little over your head and just pushing yourself to get into it and having the discipline to take it slow. Because if you are patient and focused, that's really gonna make you develop at a really fast rate. So trust me, if I got into Charlie Parker when I was 10 years old and could barely play the saxophone, I'm sure that you can get into Charlie Parker yourself or advanced phrases like the ones in this ebook. Definitely jump into it, just be patient with yourself, and you're gonna be able to reap the benefits because of it. And the more you do it, the better you're gonna play and the more fun you're gonna have playing your instrument. So I hope you'll jump into this stuff. I hope you learned something from the video today. Thanks so much for watching. As always, make sure to click like and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave me a comment in the comment section to let me know what you want me to get into next time. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.